An album quilt is essentially a fabric version of a fad of the day, which was the friendship album, which was a blank book kept by young girls, and they would ask friends and family to each sign a page and date it, and perhaps a little quote was added or a little verse of poetry, and sometimes a drawing or a little watercolor would accompany it. So if you imagine taking a blank book like that with all the signatures and quotes apart and arranging it in rows and making it in fabric, that's where you get an album quilt. The album quilts represent what I call the democratization of elegance. In the applique quilts that are from the first third of the century, we see very elegant and refined quilts being made mostly by the gentry, the most wealthy class of women who could afford these very expensive fabrics and who had a lot of leisure time to create these large and elaborately constructed quilts. By mid-century, technological advances, machine-made fabrics, machine-printed fabrics were bringing the cost down, and more segments of the middle class and the artisan class could participate in making objects of refinement such as these quilts. Some of the album quilts are a little bit like the Hallmark card that someone buys for everybody in the office to sign. Some of these album quilts were a project organized by one woman or a few women, and either they would make all the blocks and get other people to sign them, or they would assign different blocks to people or invite other people to contribute blocks. This is a fad that was popular throughout the United States. You have pieced albums of different kinds. You have simpler album quilts in other areas of the country. But in Baltimore, the genre reached an amazing pinnacle of design that you see in the album quilts here in the exhibit. An interesting aspect of the Baltimore Albums is the extent to which they represent community ties and community organizations, and that includes the participation of men. The men would most likely not have stitched these blocks, but they signed many of them. And when you look at who those people are, they often are the husbands and brothers of the women who are stitching it. So when you look at the album quilts, it's no longer a purely female production and representation of the female community. It also involves the men in the community. In Baltimore album quilt studies, there are three major design styles that have been identified and that get referred to by people studying these quilts. And in one, you see wreaths and vases of almost exclusively red and green, sometimes with touches of yellow. And in another, you have extremely elaborate blocks composed of often over 100 pieces, which may depict neoclassical designs like a harp or a lyre, the American eagle, buildings such as the U.S. Capitol or the Baltimore-Washington Monument. And in a third style, which is a much folk-artier style, so to speak, which often will include figures of animals and people. And we have quilts representing all of those styles in the exhibit.